The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Kennedy, and I'm CSI's Chief Operating Officer. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Phenomenology and Grounded Theory, Two Qualitative Approaches to Research, which will be presented by Dr. Donna Gibson. If you have questions, you can type them into the questions box on your control panel at any time during the presentation, and Dr. Gibson will leave time at the end to go through questions. There will be several times during the webinar when we will come to a slide with a poll question. When I launch the poll, you will have a few seconds to vote, and our presenter will then be able to give feedback based on how the audience voted. We always have some participants who are joining us for the first time, so I will now give a brief overview of how you can use the CSI website to obtain a continuing education certificate for one NBCC approved clock hour. To earn a continuing education certificate for attending the live webinar, attend the webinar for a full 60 minutes. While in the past we have offered a continuing education hour for attending for more than 45 minutes, to ensure that we are following NBCC's current policies for approved providers, we must now require at least 60 minutes of attendance. Because it sometimes takes people a few minutes to log in, we will have an extended time for questions from 3 until 3:10 so that you can stay online for a few more minutes if needed. If you're not able to join us for a full hour today, when the recording is posted, you'll be able to watch the remainder of the webinar and pass a short quiz for credit. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to an evaluation survey. After you've completed the survey, or the quiz if you're watching the recording, a continuing education certificate will automatically be generated and will be available in your profile on the CSI website. The follow-up email will also include a link to the webpage where you can find the recording of the webinar and download the PowerPoint slides. To view your certificate, you must log in and under the My Profile box in the upper right-hand corner, select Manage Profile. Then you may scroll down and under Contents and Features, select Professional Development. You will then click on the yellow tab that says Certifications and Programs to see a list of the certificates that you have earned through CSI. I'm now pleased to introduce our presenter. Dr. Donna Gibson is a professor of counselor education at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she also serves as the chair of the Department of Counseling and Special Education. In her 17 years as a counselor educator, Dr. Gibson has published multiple books, book chapters, and peer-reviewed publications. She has taught 30 different types of counseling classes and supervised multiple dissertations. She has also obtained over $2 million in federal grants to train school counseling students as related service providers for students in special education programs. As a member of ACA for more than 20 years, she has served as member at large for membership and president of the ACA division, the Association for Assessment in Research and Counseling. She is currently serving as AARC's representative to the ACA Governing Council and is associate editor for qualitative research for the Journal of Counseling and Development. In addition to serving on the ACA Publications Committee and editorial boards for several ACA division journals, she is currently the editor of the CSI Exemplar. Dr. Gibson received a research award from CSI International and more recently publication and research awards related to counselor professional identity development from the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision. Her teaching and mentorship has been recognized through University Teaching Awards and is a recipient of the CSI International Jane E. Myers Lifetime Mentor Award. In 2017, she received the CSI International Outstanding Chapter Faculty Advisor Award during CSI Days and was named as an American Counseling Association Fellow. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure for me to sit and talk with you today. I say talk with, even though it may seem like I'm talking at you because I can't see your lovely faces. But it really is a privilege to be asked by CSI to present on qualitative research, which is really a love of mine. I wanted to share a few goals for our webinar today. One is we're going to look at the similarities and differences between phenomenology and grounded theory research approaches. We're also going to look at the importance of matching the research question to the correct methodology. Examining the rigor of the design and analysis involved in utilizing these methods will also be something we're going to highlight, and the role of the researcher in each method. And finally, why is the method that should be compared to quantitative research? is that something that we're really focused on, comparing qualitative to quantitative? So we're going to start with a poll question. You're going to have a little bit of time to respond to this. And so if I struggle with statistics, qualitative research is a good option. Need to select one of those, yes or no. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to respond to that, and then we're going to see some of the results. Okay. Oh, wow. We could have planned this even better. So we have a 50-50 split with this. And so, you know, that's a good way to look at it, because really, I would say it depends sometimes, but really, I don't know. I think that qualitative research it's a very different type of method, but I think that those who are very good with statistics can do as well with qualitative research. And I would encourage those who struggle with statistics to keep plugging at that and to be able to accept the challenge of quantitative research too. So where does all of this begin? I'm sorry, my screen is not acting right with us. Let's get back over here. Where does all this begin? It starts with a question, and research questions are fundamental to what we do. If you ask any of my students, they would tell you that, yes, Dr. Gibson says, what is your question? And I will keep asking you that. What is your question? So as a researcher, you really need to articulate what you want to know about the intentions and the perspectives of those involved in social interactions. So we look at this ongoing process of questioning about things in our lives, our education, our research, things that we're interested in. And the results from participants collaborating with the researcher to develop those research questions, those are things as you're involved with the specific situation that you're interested in, you're going to learn more about it, and that helps to finite your research question. So it's important to think, okay, start with some ideas, but also to be reflexive and, you know, and reflective in what you're going to end up asking. So in qualitative research, we do not begin with a hypothesis or presumed outcome. We're not thinking, you know, because this is going to happen, that's going to happen. We're not going to say one is caused by the other. We do not do that. We do begin with a question or a curiosity or even a passion about a particular topic. For me, for many years, that passion has been around professional identity development. But for you, it may be about something different. So you begin with the self-questioning process, like, what do I want to know in this study? Or what's going on here? What are the basic social processes that's happening that has aroused my curiosity about this? What are the basic social psychological processes? Are there things happening within the individuals, the participants, that could be happening that I need to know more about? So our research questions in qualitative studies serve four purposes. It could be exploratory, it can be explanatory, it can be descriptive, and it can be emancipatory. Sometimes we get very wrapped up and passionate about our topics, and we think, you know, I have a lot of questions that I want answered. The issue with that is you really need to start in a simple way. And so you really need to think, what is the overarching research question? That overarching question can be the basis for initial and emerging sub-questions, and those can be answered as well in a study. But you really think about the overarching question. And so that helps you create some basic goals of the study. The goals are different than hypotheses or outcomes that we're assuming that's going to happen. We're not going to assume anything is going to happen in qualitative research. It can give the direction for the study design, the collection of the data. It can also help you create very specific interview questions if you're going to collect data through interviews. It may also give you some direction for creating other data collection pieces, such as some folks use photos in qualitative research. And so, but you need to know, what direction you're going to give participants for submitting photos or taking photos. That research question may not sound like a question, but it could sound like a purpose statement. In one of the studies that I was the lead author for in the Journal of Counselor Leadership and Advocacy for the professional identity development of tenured and tenure track counselor educators, this was a grounded theory study. But the question was, what is the professional identity development of counselor educators? That sounds pretty simple, I think, as far as a question, not necessarily the study and the design. So you can start with something that sounds like, gosh, that's going to be simple to answer, but not really when you get down and dig down into it. Sub-questions. They're related to that big overarching question, but they're typically more specific. And the interview protocol, like I said, can reflect those. So examples from the grounded theory interview protocol that you just saw the question for, the interview protocol asks the participants to define counselor education. How has that definition changed over time? How would the participants define professional identity? And then we ask them, what is your professional identity? What do you need to progress in your professional identity? And then there were some other questions, but those were some sub-questions that were reflected in the interview protocol. Another thing to keep in mind about questions is, what is the theoretical framing around the research question? Now, what does that mean, actually, theoretical framing? If you have studied qualitative research at all, you know there are some theoretical frames around it that can be specific to constructivism and postmodernism or post-positive kind of thinking. But there could also be other types of theories surrounding the question, like critical race theory. So how are you framing that research question? What are the theories underneath that? How will the questions affect the participants' lives? Think about the ethical considerations of that. And if participants are able to answer, is it ethical for you to be asking that question? How will that play out if this is going to be published? What will that mean? Is the question too broad in scope, and does it lack a context? So what if that question we asked in the study said, what is your professional identity development? Well, who did I ask? It was to counselor educators. And that gives you a context. So you know counselor educators, those folks are spending days at the beach. No, I'm joking. They're actually in higher education. And so that gives you that context. They're in counselor training programs. So that's what I mean by context. And can the question be answered? So logistically, can that question be answered in your study? How expensive will it be for you to conduct that study? Even if we're not buying a bunch of inventories to give folks, as we would do in some quantitative studies, you know, the time it takes to do interviews or collect other pieces of information to analyze, if you're analyzed with a research team, all of that stuff takes time, sometimes money, and other types of resources. Okay, before we move on, let's do our poll question number 2. When thinking about a phenomenological approach to research, we are trying to answer the what of the research question. I'm sorry. I think we messed up this question, but there's 2 answers, and I said the what or the who. I'm sorry, the what or the who of the research question. Some of that's not showing up for me. Some people have got how too. I'm glad y'all got these other responses. Okay, some folks said the what, 15% said who, and 23% said how. Okay, so as we move into talking about phenomenology, let me get back to the big screen here. I'm sorry, Macs do not like our software that we're using. Okay. Phenomenology. So if you answered the what, it is partially correct because it's what is the meaning of the experience. So the purpose of phenomenology is to discover and describe the meaning of the study participants' experiences. So with that, there is an assumption that there is an essence or essences, which can also mean meanings, to shared experience. So a lot of people get a little confused about this one. So, you know, we're just studying the experience. It's actually the meaning of the experience for the participants. So we're going to use one of the manuscripts or articles that was published in JCLA. And and you'll see the reference for it on the next slide, it was the Myers, Trepaw, Ivers, and Wester 2016 article called Wellness of Counselor Educators. Do we practice what we preach? And they use phenomenology to approach this. So here, let's look at the research question or the purpose statement. And so we see that it says the purpose of this study was to explore counselor educators' experience of wellness and their perception of factors they believe contributed or hindered their experience of wellness. Now, they didn't use the word meaning, but it's implied in looking at experience. You also see the word believe in there. So we're getting to describe the participants' experiences, wellness, and describe the meaning they made from those experiences. Researchers are seeing the phenomenon, which is the wellness of counselor educators, through the eyes or the experiences of the participants. So in that article, they do state what are counselor educators' experiences of wellness. And we're going to break this down a little bit more and thinking about what is the phenomenon here. And the phenomenon, as I mentioned, is the counselor educators' experience with wellness. Now, that may sound like a true phenomenon because how many counselor educators are being well? That's not a poll question. So we have to think about that. That can be unique. It's unique because of the context of it. We have counselor educators, higher educators, but also those who are practicing wellness and trying to describe how they're making meaning from that experience. Let's talk a little bit about sampling and some of the things that I'm going to cover will apply to sampling across different qualitative methods, not just phenomenology, but I do have it located here for us to think about. So Hayes and Singh talk about this. I'm sorry, that's a 2012 reference, not a 2000 or 20,120 reference. And they have a lot of guidelines about this to think about. One is the unit of analysis in which you're most interested with your study. We're not going to talk about all these specifically, but they do say the unit is either going to be individual, the setting, the process, the event. In phenomenology, because we're looking at the meaning of the experience, our unit of analysis is going to be at the individual level. Okay. The other thing to think about with sampling is, are there demographic factors important to your research study? Well, in the JCLA article that we're looking at, there are some demographic factors that are important, but they didn't say specifically, we are, wanting to know about the experiences of counselor educators who are assistant professors or who are between the ages of 35 and 40. They didn't say that necessarily, but that could be something that would pertain to a study that you created. Do participants have institutional roles that are essential to your study? Are you interested in creating a diverse sample? And that may be very important. Remember that theoretical frame around your question. There may be some pieces to that that make you go, okay, I've got to have this type of diversity in the sample that I collect for this study. So most of the time for phenomenological studies, we're looking at a purposive sample. I mean, there's purpose to the sample. There may be some demographic pieces around it, but the context usually makes it purposive. So for the JCLA study, they had folks that had taken the 5F well, but they were not using it for this particular study. They were saying they knew their score ranges on the 5F well, and so they were looking at people who had high and low scores on that. They were also looking for males and females. And they also looked at the rank of the counselor educator, meaning are they assistant, associate, or full professor? So what they said in the study was, we wanted to ensure that all ranks were represented, as well as both sexes, representing low and high wellness scores on the 5F well, in order to have a broad enough sample or participant perspectives. And so they ended up with one male and one female participant that were selected in each rank who had low and high wellness scores, resulting in a total of 12 counselor educators being selected for interviews, with a final sample of 11 counselor educators. So they had one that had to drop out of the study. That's pretty specific. And so when we talk about purposive sampling, that's what we end up with sometimes. So sample size. This is the other thing about qualitative research. And a lot of folks say, well, I know I don't need a lot of people in my sample. How do you know that? That's the question. How to think about it. What is the magic number? Okay, so you need to think about who would be in my sample. Are there a lot of people to select from? Even with a purposive sample, are there a lot of those folks out there in the world? Who am I excluding from my sample? And what is the suggested sample size from my research tradition? So for phenomenology, we've had this go all over, up and down on the numbers. Cresswell probably is the most, I'm going to say, infamous for recommending 10 people to be in the study. And across disciplines currently, based on the most current article that I saw, across different disciplines, which could be education, it could be health science, it could be lots of different things, the mean for phenomenological studies is around 20. But there's also this role of saturation. And I need you to listen to this, but also to think about going and digging into the research a little bit more about what saturation means. It's when you have started out with your purposive sample and you're analyzing the data and you're coming up basically with the same information again and again. When you start coding, we're going to talk about coding in a minute, but when you start coding for categories and themes, similar constructs are coming up over and over again. You're really not, even though you're going back and forth in the data, you're really not coming up with anything new after a certain point of looking at so many of the interviews or the pieces of information you're collected. So you'll also see that when the data becomes saturated, then that would be your sample size. It could mean that that means 7 people. It could mean that it's 13 people. It could mean you need to have 30 people. So I can't tell you, and I don't want you quoting me on this, that you've got to have a certain number for your sample size. You've really got to think about who that sample is, how many people are out there that would fit your criteria. If you can only get 6 people to fit the purpose of your sample or the purpose of the study, then that's probably going to be your sample. And you'll have to explain that for publication. And then you also have to think about what are the dangers of sampling too few or too many participants. If you are sampling too few, are you really getting a good idea about this phenomenon? If you are, sampling too many, is it becoming diluted? And are you really following the codes and themes that you need to be following? Poll question number 3. Should the researcher not conduct research on something they have experienced personally? Yes or no? Think about this one. Should the researcher not conduct research on something they have experienced personally? All right. So 84% of you said no and 16% said yes. And for the most part, I would say no, that you can research something that you have experienced personally. Actually, that's where most of us find that passion because it has impacted us in some way. It may not be the direct experience, but it could. Many, many moons ago, I published a phenomenological study on leadership and as a non-tenure professor being in a leadership role. And my colleagues and I, we interviewed a bunch of folks who fit the criteria for that phenomenon, but it affected me too because I was one of those people. And so I thought this was unusual. This is what's going on, and I need to understand it better because it's affecting my personal, professional life. And so, yeah, passion can drive that. There are instances, though, when it may become too close to you. That shouldn't preclude you from doing the research, but there are things that you need to put in the process to help yourself and guide your way. So that's why I have this role of the researcher slide for you. And it talks about, I'm sorry, I don't know why it blipped out on us. Hold on. Talks about reflexivity. And this is the ability to be self-reflective in the research process and really think about why are you doing this study? What is your role in doing this study? What do you need help with in this study? And there's other questions you can ask yourself in the self-reflection process. Subjectivity is your understanding of the phenomenon. Again, it's your understanding. It doesn't necessarily mean it's everyone else's understanding of the phenomenon that's in it. That's why you're doing the research, right? So you really have to, sort of put that out there that this is my understanding of this, but also note that you have to be open to understanding and hearing other people's perceptions of that, how they're making meaning through their experience. You also need to look at the voice of the participants and how accurate you're reflecting that voice. Are you also representing the emotional content in what they're telling you? How complete are you representing those experiences and the meaning of those experiences? Sometimes to help do all of this, we're using peer debriefers. This is where a research team member serves as a reflection of the researcher's responses to the process, which is, I think it's always a good idea. And a research team, does it make sense for your study to have a research team? And so a research team could be those that help you with data collection. Well, we can even back up further than that. Those individuals who are talking with you through the methodology, creating interview questions, or how you're going to collect data, what types of methods. It could be folks who help with coding and data analysis. So research teams can look any way you want to put them together, but the triangulation of investigators will help you with what we call trustworthiness, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. Data collection. There are different types of data collection for phenomenological research. For interviews, it's one of the primary types of methods for data collection. You can have individual or focus group interviews. You can have open interviews where you can start with really big questions and just sort of go with the participant and the story that they tell you. You could also have a semi-structured interview where you basically have an interview protocol of questions that you're going to give them. The focus of the interviews means you're going to try to get a description of the meanings of the phenomena from the participants. You're going to verify that information, and you're going to allow the participant opportunity to provide more detail and expand on that information. Good practice is always to have the participant give a final approval, and sometimes that comes in what we call a member checking process, where they're going to look at the transcript of the interview and they can clarify any information you need with them. Interview style. As counselors, we're at an advantage. Hopefully you have learned very, very, very good active listening skills. And so if you look up any interviewing research book on interviewing, you will see that really good paraphrasing, clarification, summarizing, reflection of feelings, self-revelation, empathetic listening skills. That's what's needed in a good interview. Observations, also another way to collect data, as well as visuals, and this is what I was referring to earlier. Sometimes we collect photos. We also can collect written materials and analyze that information. That's why a lot of people can do phenomenological and other types of qualitative research using data through online sources. Some people have done it through chat rooms or online feeders that you can get that written work from. Interview questions. I have some information here, and I have some information in our grounded theory section about interview questions. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but it's important, and this is, this is something you learn in counseling training. It's really important to use the language of the participants. If you're going to use a whole different style or formality to your questions and not be with your participants, then that's going to disrupt the interview itself. And if they're reading the questions and responding in that way in a written format, sometimes just like trying to figure out what are you asking exactly, because it doesn't match their language or their style of language. So also in phenomenology, we tend to start with very descriptive or narrative context questions. Tell me a little bit about your current position as a counselor educator. That's something that we started with. And also, how would you define wellness? In the other study, the JCLA study on wellness, you would want to ask them how they would define wellness. And then varying the structure of the questions in order to clarify the phenomenon, what are some of your thoughts about the wellness of counselor educators? So that's just a beginning part for interviews. Data analysis. There's some very good books out there about analyzing data and phenomenology. Cresswell is one that's cited often. One thing, as we talked about the role of the researcher needs to describe his or her own experience with the object of the study, and in an effort to identify any prejudice or personal judgments that could impact the analysis. Cresswell also talks about horizontalization of data, and this is where you'll take a transcript and you're going to look at each relevant quote of the study topic and give it equal value to other quotes. What are the participants saying? What are the relevant topics expressed by the research participants? And then you're going to group those topics into units of meaning. So, for example, you'll have a transcript, and let's say you're talking to the counselor educators about wellness. I'm just going to make this assumption because that wasn't my study. But let's say, you know, they find a hard time fitting wellness practices in, and you start seeing that, and you may want to code it like time for wellness or something like that. And so those units of meaning become part of what your analysis has in it. So you will go on, you would have your verbatim quotes to match that unit of meaning in your topics, and then you'll have a structural description of that. So what is the essence or the meaning of the phenomenon? What are the common elements repeated in each of the research participants? So it could be that, you know, in this study, time. Surprise, surprise, time became one of those things, like leisure, flexibility, balance. These are the things, those topics that came out and became part of the structure of the phenomenon. Congruence was another, as well as professional supports. And you see that the professional supports included not only folks who were in their work setting, but also in their family or outside relationships. I would say data analysis and qualitative research is really the art of the art and science of research. Sometimes you really have to live in that data for a while to get at these topics that are highlighted in the participants' voices and meanings they're making. I talked about trustworthiness a little bit. Trustworthiness pertains to all types of qualitative research as well. So this is basically what we mean by the credibility or the believability of the study. We don't have really what we call validity or reliability in qualitative research. We talk about trustworthiness. And so we're looking at transferability. That does not mean generalizability. And so one of the biggest things I see with manuscripts that come into JCD is that when people do talk about generalizability in their qualitative research, I'm like, we don't do that. We really have to think about transferability, which means that that detailed description of the study process helps us determine if the findings can be applied to individuals or settings. We're not assuming it can be applied to all counselor educators who practice wellness. We have to look at how they did the study, what processes they put in there to determine, oh, this may pertain to, counselor educators who practice wellness, but it's not an end-all be-all. It's not generalizable necessarily. Dependability or consistency of results over time in researchers. This again, we're going to determine that dependability on how you describe how you analyze, you collected and you analyzed your data. We also have confirmability, which is really those genuine reflections of the participants, that your bias has been avoided. Authenticity, did you present those participant perspectives in a genuine way? Coherence, the research method was used appropriately for the question. If your research method did not match your question, that is a fatal flaw in research. So you really have to say, was that really a phenomenological question that was asked? Because they use phenomenology, but was that a phenomenological question or vice versa? Looking at your sampling, the ethical validation, and creativity. Where, you don't have to have all of those things, but sometimes it's pretty cool when we see people get creative, yet adhere to good research standards. How do you do all this? We have reflexive journals where you're writing memos that you write during the whole process from start to finish that gives you information as you go forward. Member checking, not only is that checking a transcript out with them for verification, but you may have to go back to members and ask them for additional information. Prolonged engagement. Typically, these are longer interviews or multiple interviews, multiple data points. It could be interviews and other materials collected. And that's what I mean by triangulation as well. So your data sources and your data methods, if you use more than one type of thing or one type of investigator to do something, so you could be the main researcher and you could have a peer debriefer. You could also have a research team. So you're triangulating your investigators, and that increases the trustworthiness of it. So for this JCLA manuscript, they had a triangulation of investigators, and they also used prolonged engagement. I didn't see any other evidence of other sources of trustworthiness, but I wouldn't be surprised if they memoed through or had reflexive journals, or also used member checking and having them check the transcripts. All right, that's a lot, but we're moving on to grounded theory. Poll question number 4. When thinking about a grounded theory approach to research, we are trying to answer the blank of the research question. All right, let's see, we're getting close. We're locked in. We're asking the how at 74%, the what at 19%, and the who at 74%. Well, let's see, what are we trying to answer? We're trying to explain it. And so we're trying to really explain the how of what's being studied. And usually it is a phenomenon again. So that's why I get asked a lot about grounded theory. What makes it different than phenomenology? Because a lot of times it's about phenomenon, for both of them. So Well, one is usually you don't know anything about the phenomenon, so you have to sort of take that first dive into what is it and what are people's experiences of it. The other piece is the type of question you ask, and it means it's a how question. And when you're trying to explain something and not just describe it, like what is it, you're trying to say how does this happen, then you've entered grounded theory world. So you see that I talked about sometimes you're using selected grounded theory methods like qualitative data analysis to explore the research, but qualitative data analysis is not a method. It's just a way of looking at the data. It really goes back, what type of method you are using goes back to that question. So again, when's it appropriate to use it? Again, you don't know much about the topic, okay? But how does it happen? And you're going to generate a theory that has explanatory power about the desired outcome. And that is grounded theory. Back to professional identity development. Wanted to know, what is it? How does it happen? And so asking that particular question, we knew that we were going to have to look at development or a process. And so if you're thinking, okay, I've got a question and it's really like, the development of something or the process of something, then more than likely you're looking at a grounded theory study. Some of the theory behind theory making itself is it's social constructionist. That social piece means that there are some societal factors or cultural factors around the phenomenon that are going to have an influence on the development or the process. And constructivist, of course, means that you're looking at the participant's meaning. Back to the manuscript that we had published in JCLA on the development of tenured and tenure-track counselor educators. Our question was, what is the professional identity development of counselor educators who are tenured, are in tenure-track faculty positions? And this is the part when I really wish I could hear your voices, because I would say, what kind of sampling was that? And I hope I would hear like this roar of propulsive, Dr. Gibson, because that is exactly what it was. It was very specific. But you said, okay, Dr. Gibson, but you started with what is. So yeah, you got to read a little further. So what is the professional identity development of that? And you could ask somebody, what is your professional identity? But when you add development to it, it lends itself to the process. Sampling. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here since we did it back with the phenomenology. It's very similar. You're going to look at, you can sample lots of different ways. I listed proposive, modified random. A lot of people are like, what are you talking about? And I hear about that with quantitative, not with qualitative. I also hear about snowball. Snowball is when you have participants who fit the criteria and they also sort of refer to another person who fits the criteria. And it's your job to verify that the next person fits that criteria. Modified random, though, is you could have a lot of people fit the criteria and you select them randomly to be able to use in your sample. How many, again, back to that other criteria, you're going to have to figure out how many you're going to need for the purpose of your study based on all those different criteria. What we did was we did put a call out on the SESNet. The SESNet listserv, if you're not familiar with that, that is the listserv for counselor education and supervision. And it's not, I would say, the optimal way to do this, but we do know a lot of counselor educators are lurking on the listserv. And so we put out the call with the criteria. And what's interesting is we only had 5 people respond to that? I go, okay. So then we had to resort to purposeful chain sampling. And that is, once we were identifying someone, were we able to, from that one person, identify another person that would fit that criteria. And so what we had to do was we were looking at tenured and tenured track counselor educators across ranks, because we wanted to look at those that were assistant levels, also associate and full. We knew we could not capture one person in all of those ranks at one time without doing a longitudinal study, which you could do. We did sort of a cross sampling of folks, and so we were able to get 6 folks at each level of rank. That's how we ended up with 18. Again, what are the processes that we're looking at? What's the best way to get at that information? In this study, it was essential that we needed to do individual interviews. And so those interviews lasted, most of the time they were lasting 2 to 2.5 hours. And then we also collected vitas, and we also checked back in with them. So there was a lot of back and forth with the individuals being interviewed. You could use focus groups. I have a resource at the end of the webinar about the use of focus groups, and I have done that as well in the past. You can also use documents and other sources of information. For focus groups, you have group requirements. For one study that we did with counseling students, we made sure that all of those students were at a certain point in the program and were able to talk with all of them, and then also look at considerations for that. Any power differentials among the focus group members, as well as the interviewer in the focus group. Are there pre-established small groups? Could you use those, or what are the problems with using pre-established small groups? To environment and recent history, who's the moderator or the interviewer, as well as confidentiality. With focus groups, it's very similar to counseling groups, and as far as confidentiality is concerned, we cannot guarantee that, but we emphasize that it's important to maintain some level of integrity with the process and confidentiality. Poll question number 5. If grounded theory is used to explain something without any preconceived ideas, should you not use a structured interview? Yes or no? Almost there. All right. So we're at 71% no and 29% yes. And so this is emphasis. Should you not use a structured interview? So the answer is it's okay to use a structured interview, because I'm getting to that with y'all. Because you have a lot of information you need to find out for the purpose of a grounded theory study. And so it's, even though you say, well, I'm creating a theory, I shouldn't know anything. I don't know a lot about this topic, but what should I know? And that's where you do fall back on related literature. We fell back on literature around just professional identity and professional identity development in other disciplines to say, what can we ask, or what don't we know about counselor educators and professional identity? And we also put those questions in there. So it's okay to have the structured interview instead of just one big question, because you're going to need to get at this process or this development piece. And to be able to do that across many different people, you're going to have that structured interview. So again, there's some more. I encourage you to download this PowerPoint from your after we're done, because there's a lot of good ideas about interviews. And, you know, again, going anywhere from the selection of the research participants, getting in depth with them in the interview, having that interview protocol, getting those details. All of that's very important. We did mainly phone and Skype interviews for the purpose of that study. You could do face-to-face interviews as well. I think I like to have the face-to-face and the Skype or whatever mode. You can see somebody so you can get some of those visual cues. If you don't have the visual cues from being face-to-face, you really need to be a very careful and active listener to pick up on when you need to follow up with someone. And meaning, like, maybe there's a hesitancy in answering a question. You may need to like prompt them or to follow up on the hesitancy with it. So good active listening skills are necessary with all of these interviews. Again, these are also very helpful hints for the grounded theory interview and for other interviews, looking at asking background questions. Sometimes you'll have a demographic questionnaire that you can use that will help, but there may be some that you want to ask verbally and get that information for their background. Be careful of assuming knowledge, and that will prevent you from asking a question. So when you're constructing your interview protocol, put them all down there. Put down any question that relates, whether it's to background or to detail, and you'll find out quickly if your overarching question doesn't get to that information, maybe your follow-up questions will get to that information. We have found that we put all the questions down, and most of the time, the participants are answering those questions earlier, and we don't have to do as many follow-up questions. But go ahead and write them down, and that will help you figure out how to structure the interview. What questions should you start with first? What's going to lead to the participants being able to answer the question without you having to ask the follow-up? Okay, so this is what I was saying. We had about 2 hours for most of this. We asked, our questions were around the definition of counselor education, changes in their definition of that over time, definition of professional identity, factors that influence their own needs and progress in their professional identity, and their prioritization of counselor educator roles. If you haven't seen the study and you're a counselor educator or going in that direction, I encourage you to look at it because there's some very similar results that occur between this one and some of our other professional identity development studies. Data analysis, that's a lot on a slide, isn't it? So this isn't a simple process. So I encourage you to look at Charmez, which is one of the resources at the end, to look at how we do this. And initial coding is the first piece of that after, looking at the role of the researcher and the researcher's bias. You can code word by word, line by line, incident with incident. You don't have to do all three of those things. You can choose which way you're going to do. Typically, I've fallen back on line by line coding, but it depends on what you're studying. So word by word may be more appropriate, or incident by incident. And then we're looking at comparing data. We're comparing data with data to find similarities and differences across the participants, but also within one participant's interview, if there's differences and similarities in what they're saying. There may be some special terms that they're using, and that's called in vivo codes. And that wording may be something that we really like and we want to use. We go on to focus coding. Those are codes that appear more frequently among the initial codes, and they may have more significance. So we have to sift through those after we do the focus coding. And we get to axial coding. This is where we actually are relating the categories to subcategories of information. And that leads us to looking at the process of how these codes and these categories work together with each other, and that is the theory. I'm not going to go over trustworthiness again, but just to remember those are things that we use. So this is a visual model of the results, and when I talked about the codes emerging, these are like themes, right? These three vertical pieces are themes. But the process is what's across the front and the top. And so we see the process or the theory is this need for external validation over time, and with rank, it becomes a self-validation piece. And we see with the responsibility in counselor education, the assistant professors, they don't really have a specific focus on their responsibilities yet. And they rely on the expert definitions of counselor education when they're defining it. Over time, we see that the focus and the responsibility becomes more on the students. They're reflective as they're in their role as a gatekeeper to this integrated role of servant leader later on in counselor education. So you can see where you can get these codes and how they function over time in these processes. And that's how the theory emerges. That sounds so fast and quick, but it takes a while. You have to live in the data for a little bit. With grounded theory, I know we're running short on time, but with grounded theory, we do tend to see more illustrative models like the one I just showed you. It can visually represent the process or the development of the theory you've created. And so you look at learning styles of readers, how to create that visual model. I would say keep it as simple as possible if you can, but also try to find visual ways to demonstrate the process. And so that's why arrows and showing the flow of things may be necessary. Poll question number 6, this is the last one. Using software for the data analysis can eliminate the need for auditors and or research team members. Yes or no? No, 98%. Y'all are pretty positive about that. And yes for 2%. The 98% folks are correct. It is not a substitute for that. In fact, I've only used software for this for very few studies. And it really helps me manage the data, but it does not tell me what the themes or the codes or the theory will be. So I find it to be a good management system for the data. So let me quickly try to jump to my other monitor over here, if I can find it. Sorry. My mouse is not jumping screens. There you go. No? All right, hold on. Okay. There's some advantages and disadvantages of using the software. Again, large amounts of data. It helps you find keywords. It will help you find specific codes that you have created if you have noted that in the software. But it doesn't let you see the nuances of culture, language. Can be expensive, not necessarily user-friendly. I promise you on that. And you really need to talk it out, I think, with other folks, especially an auditor or some other research team members. Last slide before the resource slide, reporting results. These are definitely longer manuscripts, so that's important to note when you're looking at journals to publish in. You need to be very detailed in your procedures, how you analyze the data, your trustworthiness, and your role of the researcher. You need to talk about any biases you have and how you're accounting for those. Quotes and descriptions, we're counting on you to provide direct quotes to basically, that's your evidence, your support of the themes that you have. And as a editor in for journals, I'm looking for multiple sources of quotes for those themes or those codes, not just one for each. So those are just some helpful hints with that. I know we can talk a lot more about writing it up. That could be a whole other 3 webinars. Here are some resources. There are a lot of good ones, and so this is not an exhaustive list, but here's some that we have, and also the manuscripts that I use as examples in the webinar. Thank you for letting me go over a few minutes. We have some time for questions, I think, if we have any.
Yes, the first question that has come in is, for grounded theory, I have noticed that many counseling scholars cite different traditions of grounded theory, such as Glasser, Strauss, Sharmaz. What implications do you believe that this has on the research and the counseling profession's research using grounded theory?
That's a big question. It's a good question. I look at a lot of different ones myself, and really, the main, I think, implication is that there's no one exact way of doing this. I know some people will write or they'll actually edit. There maybe be an associate editor or someone who's reviewing a manuscript, and they'll say, well, you did not use so many participants, and you use this for data analysis, or I didn't see this, and so you can't be published in this journal. I think that's a very incorrect way of approaching this. So I think that when you're talking about those individuals for grounded theory, or it could be a set for phenomenology or CQR, whatever it is, that the foundation of it is the same, but there may be some different wording on how to analyze data, but the process is a very similar process. And so I think that as long as you are transparent in the approach that you used and are able to cite how that you've applied that approach to your study, I think that will bode well for whoever's going to be publishing in our profession.
Thank you. Our next question comes back to a term that you discussed earlier. Can you please explain horizontalization again, and what you mean when you say to give each quote equal value?
Okay, so horizontalization, is easier to think about it than to say, is looking at, it's best for me to use an example. So if you had a transcript and you had a participant say one statement, you know, and you're looking at that, and you had another participant who said a similar statement or a different statement, you're still going to weigh those equally. You're not going to discount other things that are being said in the interview. So you're going to take them all in and not discount them, but you're also going to do this constant comparison piece as well. It's easier to read more about it than me to sit here to explain. I'm so visual too, and folks tend to be very visual in research. And so to be able to say, you know, you're going to give equal weight to what people say in their voices and the participants' voices. And so what you're going to find, though, is across participants, that you may not see one particular statement stand out as much as some other ones do. It may be more common across participants. I'm sorry, I'm sort of fumbling around with that, but it's something that probably needs a little more research into understanding.
Thank you. We'll do one more question in our last minute. For grounded theory, can you unpack what you mean by the how of what is being studied? And do you mean how it came to be?
Not necessarily how it came to be as far as like how in this world it came to be, but it's more of that process or how it came to be for that participant. So when we're looking at the phenomenon, in this particular piece, we were looking at the phenomenon of professional identity development in counselor educators. So you have to think about the context of it as well. We're looking at how did they have that identity of counselor educator develop over time for them. And so our founding part was we're gonna look at those who are just starting out in the profession. That doesn't discount things that happened in their earlier part of their lives or maybe even in a different profession. But right now, when they define it, because they are just new in the profession itself, what are we taking into account? And as we move forward with associate level folks and with full professors, do we see any other patterns emerging in what they're reporting to us around professional identity? And we did. And so it's not necessarily how did this come to be in this earth, but it is for that person and their experience and what factors led or contributed to that development. I hope that helps.
Thank you. We have reached the end of the webinar. Everyone who attended for at least 60 minutes will be receiving an email with a link to an evaluation survey that will be sent within 2 hours from now. And after you've completed the survey, you'll be able to download a continuing education certificate for 1 NBCC approved clock hour. If you weren't able to join us for a full 60 minutes today, you'll still be able to watch the rest of the webinar and complete a short quiz for credit. The follow-up email will also provide a link to the webpage where you can download the PowerPoint slides. Our next webinar will be next Wednesday, March 21st. Dr. Vaughn Milner and Virginia Pike, JD, will offer a presentation titled Adolescent Sexting, Legal and Ethical Issues for Professional Counselors. If you will be attending that presentation, please note that we will begin the webinar a half hour earlier than our usual start time. The webinar will begin at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time instead of at 2. And again, we'll offer 10 minutes of questions at the end so that everyone can receive a full 60 minutes if you need to log in a few minutes late. Thank you to everyone who attended today. And Dr. Gibson, we appreciate that you shared this presentation with us.
Thank you.